What's up, ladies and gentlemen of the internet? It's your boy, Jack Slack. Fights Gone By podcast, episode 75? And you catch me between writing an article about bare-knuckle boxing and writing an article about Gaethje versus Dustin Poirier. So, anyone who thought I was all about the technique, no, I'm about the blood. That's what I'm about. And then I'm watching Ken versus Tito after this. I've been working my way through Tito's UFC career. Various pans in the fire. Fingers in pies. Used to know a man called Mikey Many Pies because he had his fingers in a lot of pies. Just time for a quick catch-up before the weekend, and we'll do some previews of the UFC and Bellator events. Less so the Bellator one. It's kind of fallen through for me, but we'll talk about that in a minute. Let's do some news. So the big piece of news, which isn't really a piece of news, so let's be careful about it, is the UFC apparently doing a TV split with ESPN and NBC. Now, I put this aside as like, I'll read that fully later. It sounds complicated. No, the site, ThereseOwens.com, literally all in like 14-point font, in bold, wrote, per our great source, which was a guy on the UG, this deal is worth a total of $320 million per year, $160 million per year each. ESPN and NBC to pay for production. Current deal, UFC pays for production. Brackets, sorry. Current deal, UFC pays for production. ESPN and NBC will also have streaming rights and the Fight Pass prelims moving to their streaming platforms. I assume that would mean that the Fight Pass still got those prelims. Contender series to replace Tough. This is where it starts to get too good to be true. Tough getting killed off. Can't believe that. Each network gets one season each per year. Pay-per-views reduced to 6 a year. Now we're really in cloud cuckoo land. New weight classes to be added to help fill increased fight nights. Men 165, female 105, etc. Each network will have exclusive rights to certain fighters, similar to how HBO and Showtime have their own boxes, which they develop and build outside of PPV. Remember, you heard it here first, TO. And if you're signing your own news paste, probably, But, yeah, I mean, a lot of that sounds like bollocks. It does sound like a UFC idea to shore up the holes in the roster by building more divisions so that the talent from surrounding divisions migrates to that division. But that doesn't really shore up the roster, but then you've got more people in the top 10. But then equally, do you know who's in the flyweight top 10 for women? Nobody knows or gives a shit. 6 pay-per-views a year would be a dream. I mean, I, personally, would do 4. I'm sounding like Ron Paul. I would cut all of them. Cut every department. But yeah, I would cut down to 4 pay-per-views a year and make them fucking massive. And then do everything else televised. Put everything on the Fight Pass, and then you could charge whatever you wanted. I would pay $30 a month, $40 a month, probably $50 a month, just to have access to everything, and then you're paying $60 a month for pay-per-view now as it is, and then they would cut out the cost of running a pay-per-view. Anyway, it seems too good to be true, and it is from MMA Logic on the Underground, but this is just proving again, you can tweet fucking anything you want, and people will believe it. Conor versus Mayweather, I don't think we touched on it last week, I hope we didn't, but yeah, with 4-ounce gloves in a cage, but still boxing. And with no boots. That was announced last week by some guy called Mma something, and he's just some Burke who owns a sports brand that no one knew about. And he said it was happening, and then a couple of hours later he said, whoa, I didn't say it was happening. But, he got his attention, and people got to talk about their story for the day. This sport runs on bollocks. And shit journalism. And you can believe me because I'm a reporter, allegedly. I've been alleged to be a reporter. I think I've got a libel case there if I want it. Other interesting news. Holm versus Megan Anderson is in the works. I like that. That sounds like a good fight. It means that Megan Anderson doesn't jump straight in with Cyborg. Does mean that Cyborg will fight some other schlub in the meantime. And Holm might get a win. I mean, I like that fight because Megan Anderson, obviously known as a striker, but as strikers go, who's she for? Charmaine Tweet is not a striker, no matter how much Julie Gaethje is trying to sell spinning back slaps. Oh, she calls it the sassy slap. She said that about 3 times in the Charmaine Tweet Megan Anderson fight, and it got worse every time. It was like, she calls it the rear view. It was so bad. And Charmaine Tweet is a very bad striker. Objectively, I don't think even her own coaches would claim she wasn't. Ray Borg versus Brandon Moreno is rebooked for UFC Chile. Good stuff. Ray Borg gets paid. I like that. And more interesting piece of news, Bare-Knuckle FC becomes the first promotion to hold a bare-knuckle fight sanctioned by the state in the United States since 1899, which would have been John L. Sullivan versus Jake Kilrain. I wrote an article about this week, which you can read. I think I wrote it yesterday, went up yesterday. It's called The Return of Bare-Knuckle Boxing, and it just sort of discusses how things like BKB and stuff like that's taken off. Not really bare-knuckle, and definitely not the rules that they used to fight under. Basically, modern boxing, but you wear wraps instead of gloves. So you can punch as hard as you like without really worrying about breaking your wrist, which was the main thing that made bare-knuckle boxing, as in pugilism in the old days, so different from boxing nowadays. Also, rounds and how rounds ended. In the London prize ring rules, the round ends when you get knocked down, and then you get 30 seconds with your corner, and then you have to make it up to the mark or the scratch under your own power. So if you lose under London prize fight rules, you've really been beaten, because I can't make it up there with 30 seconds. Oh, the other thing that BKB does is a 20 count, but they don't stop the clock. So when you watch Jimmy Sweeney get knocked down by Melvin Glard, he's an experienced enough boxer to know to take the count. As much of the count as he can. So he stands there taking a 19 count. That's almost half a minute off the round. And then the round ends and he goes back to his corner, he's fine. Seems like a rule set made to give you less knockouts, if anything. But you get a bit more blood, but not as much as you would if it was truly bare knuckle. I'm just saying bring back real bare knuckle. It'd be fun to... maybe I will, if this whole thing takes off. I'll just get a rich backer to help me pick out amateur prospects who aren't quite good enough for the Olympics, and we'll start training them up specifically for bare knuckle, or wrapped fist. Anyway, what we're going to do today is talk about some of these fights this weekend. We got a UFC on Fox, I believe. Yeah, UFC on Fox 29, and we got a Bellator on. Is it Paramount now? I believe it's Paramount. So we'll talk about those fights a little bit, and then we'll do some questions, and then I'll let you get on with your week, and we'll reconvene to talk about how the fights were. What have we got that's interesting going on the UFC card? Luke Sanders versus Patrick Williams. Can't tell you much about that. Yushin Okami is back in the UFC, which is interesting enough, because he obviously came in at short notice to save that fight with OSP. Got submitted very quickly by Von Fluchoke. Always embarrassing. And God, he just looked dwarfed in that fight, because he was a big middleweight, but he managed to get down to welterweight after he left the UFC, whereas Ovin St. Preux could very well be a heavyweight. So that happened in September of last year. He's taken a little break since then, and he's coming back to fight Diego Lima. This seems to be a favour to Okami, because everyone knows that Okami's not a fun fighter. Unless he's fighting severely overmatched opponents on the Japanese scene, he's not finishing fights. Or Evan Tanner. He did finish Evan Tanner, and that was an interesting break with form. Meanwhile, Diego Lima came in off the Ultimate Fighter, season 25, and he had one fight in the UFC since then at the finale, where Jesse Taylor choked him. Yeah, I mean, that's an interesting enough main event. I mean, if you're having trouble with Jesse Taylor's grappling, Yushin Okami is a smothering, blanketing fighter. This is at welterweight, so he will be a big lad down there. So it could be interesting. I mean, do you remember when Yushin Okami used to come out southpaw and spam the jab? And people were like, that's what a jab in MMA should be like. And then he fought Anderson Silva. And it turned out that if you never throw a feint, and if every time you jab, you stamp your foot down, it's really easy to time the counter jab. And Anderson Silva knocked him down with a counter jab. Yushin Okami is a figment of the past, but his grappling is still good enough that he can smother a lot of dudes. First, we've got Lauren Mueller versus Shayna Dobson, two people with 4 fights each. Hey, Durinho's back. Gilbert Burns versus Dan Morit. Like it. That over-the-back armbar that Durinho hit against, was it Sajewski? He was in the UFC. Maybe it was Alex Oliveira. He arm-locked him too. But yeah, that was gorgeous. I love an over-the-back armbar. Man, he's armbarred 3 dudes in the UFC. That's insane. Very few people picking up that many armbars. I mean, that's why Ronda Rousey was such an interesting character. Sakuraba had an incredible record for armbars. Something like 10 or 12 or something like that in his career. He's armbarred a lot of people. He's known for the Kimura, but he armbarred a lot of dudes. But yeah, I always enjoy watching Durinho. Durinho versus Gary Tonin was that Polaris? It was one of the main submission grappling events, but it was terrific fun. Tonin just keeps getting taken down, scrambling up to like a dogfight position and standing up so that Durinho will run round to his back and then he'll roll on the leg. It was a Bassroot and wet dream. Yeah, really fun fight that. Give it a watch. And I've always got my eye on Durinho. I mean, he's sort of like under the radar, even though he's 12-2 and he's got a win over Alex Oliveira. He did struggle against Rashid Magomedov and who was it? Michael Prazeres. But he's coming off a knockout win, so maybe he'll get some attention. Oh God, I just remembered. Yeah, he pulled out of that fight with Oben Mercier because he was. The reason here on Tapology is that he was deemed too heavy to attempt weight cut, but that would have been a good fight. Oh, especially after watching Oben Mercier nuke Evan Dunham the other night. Also interesting that it's timed up so well that they both ended up fighting at the same time anyway after that, or almost the same time. Jotko versus Brad Tavares. Interesting enough. Wow, Brad Tavares is still ranked number 11 in the world at middleweight, according to Tapology. I don't know what he is on the UFC rankings, but that's interesting. Wilson Hayes versus John Moraga. This is an interesting fight, to be honest, because you've actually got two fairly decent flyweights matching up. A lot of flyweight is like one guy you know and one guy you've never heard of. And the guy you know will probably win, and then we can start working him towards Demetrius Johnson. John Moraga has been around forever, though. And Wilson Hayes. Are we still pretending Wilson Hayes is a really good fighter? Hayes hasn't fought since he got blown out by Henry Cejudo back in, when was that? September again, on the Nunes Shevchenko 2 undercard. Oh no, it was the main card. But, like, that was the only thing going on that main card. He just blasted him. It was karate Henry Cejudo turned up. And again, it was that open side angle that Demetrius Johnson had used against him all through their first fight. Sorry, not first fight, through their only fight. Wilson Hayes has never been a good striker, never will be a good striker probably at this point. Some guys were playing it up in the pre-fight stuff before the Demetrius Johnson one, but I mean he was struggling with Yuta Sasaki immediately before that title fight. He's a fun enough grappler sometimes. In the Bellator tournament, he was fighting some guys who just couldn't keep up with him on the ground, and he was hitting his Wilson guard open and pass, which is gorgeous. Or the Sao Paulo pass, or the Tozy pass, whatever you want to call it. But, he's even on the ground, he's looked fairly underwhelming in a lot of his recent performances against Yuta Sasaki. Like, Sasaki was stalling him out in plenty of positions. Fun fact, between him and Borg, they'd finished one fight between them in, like, their last 8. Yeah. That's always a good one to bring up to piss off the Demetrius Johnson fanboys. Or the people who would desperately want to think that you hate Demetrius Johnson just because you don't rate his recent competition. But John Moraga's always fun. I mean, he can catch a guillotine from anywhere. I think it's the Scoggins fight where he's getting mounted and he's holding onto the guillotine and then he hip bumps all the way back to guard. He caught Scoggins, he attacked Scoggins with like 20 guillotines in that fight, but he finally caught him in the end, which was impressive. His striking's been coming on a bit. He was decent against Sergio Pettis. He was actually beating Pettis to the punch, but Pettis was following up with combinations after he'd been hit. And Moraga was just standing there and admiring his work. I mean, that's the difference between like an experienced striker and someone who's just getting into it and starting to surprise people with how quick they are, but not really having the science. Or just the experience to keep punching once you get hit. Muslim Salakov's back. He's always alright. Antonio Carlos Jr. versus Tim Boetsch. This was the fight that was dragging the Dwyer score of this whole event upwards. If you don't know what the Dwyer score is, it's a method of charting momentum coming into events. So it's basically done on recent wins and losses, and you get points for wins and losses in like your last 5. So like the best event in UFC history on the Dwyer score, I think it was Aldo versus McGregor, and that had something like 40-something. This event has -1. They're really worth looking up if you're just interested in getting an assessment on what the UFC thinks of the people buying or watching these cards, what they reckon they can get away with. Michelle Waterson versus Courtney Casey. That's a good fight. Casey lost to Gaethje back in the day. I say back in the day, that was like 2016, and then has only fought twice since, but she had that split decision loss to Felice Herrig. But Michelle Waterson suffered 2 back-to-back. The crushing defeat to Rose Namajunas, who really had a number, and Tisha Torres in a long-distance decision. Yeah, I never know where I stand on Waterson as a striker. Sometimes she looks good, and sometimes she looks very style over substance. Lots of side kicks and hook kicks and things that aren't really doing anything. And against Rose Namajunas, she decided to spam the low line side kick and kept throwing herself onto a slight inferior angle each time she missed. Which is how Rose Namajunas landed the right straight the few times that happened, and then the high kick that followed it to knock her down. But Michelle Waterson, I hope she gets back on track. Always seems like a fun fighter. The only thing is that my best memories of Michelle Waterson are the Pena fight, which was ages ago now, and I believe that was atomweight, so she is a little bit small for this weight class, even the smallest weight class in the UFC. And the other thing that I remember her for is beating up that old granny in Invicta, where they showed on the pre-fight graphic, they showed everyone's age except for that fight. They showed like something completely unrelated to anything useful. Might have just slotted in an extra thing for nationality, but they were well aware that they were giving Michelle Waterson an easy win, and it was pretty embarrassing. But yeah, not a lot to say about that fight, but it should be interesting. Israel Adesanya is back, and he was flying under my radar for this fight. I'm normally first to know on the Israel Adesanya news. He's fighting Marvin Vettori. What I've seen of Vettori, I remember his fight with Omari, what's his name? But a decent southpaw, great body kick. Really good body kick. A heavy hitter. More plodding in his style than Adesanya. And what I remember from that fight particularly was that he doesn't like being pressured back onto the fence. He gives ground quite readily, and you can sort of overwhelm him. Because Omari was just sort of swinging at him and really troubled him. Israel Adesanya, if you watch his fight with Rob Wilkinson, or any of his fights against guys, once he's already proven that he can stop the takedowns, he's very good at backing them up towards the fence, using feints, throwing them off constantly. Against Wilkinson, he had some beautiful, pump fake of the kick and then step in with the 1-2, or pump fake of the jab and then body kick. Yeah, it would be really interesting. Obviously, Israel Adesanya switches stances quite a lot, but it'd be interesting to see him going with his right foot to the open side, because I think he's right-footed and right-handed. Could be a matchup of body kicks here. For Vettori, I think you've got to try and slow the pace, keep it out of range, at extended range, and step in when you're ready to strike, or really get in his face. I think hanging around in mid-range where those feints are going to bamboozle you, and the question mark kicks and body kicks are going to have you reaching for stuff that's not there. I think all the way in or all the way out, he's dealing with a really dangerous kicker, even if his game is strong on kicks. Just try and dictate when you're in range to do it. But that'll be interesting to watch anyway. And then the co-main event is Carlos Condit versus Alex Oliveira. This one was Carlos Condit versus Matt Brown, but that fell through. And I was sort of in a don't re-sign it position. I'm waiting for Condit to retire, because after every loss he comes out and he goes, I just don't think I have it anymore. And then he comes back and fights again anyway. Aside from that performance against Robbie Lawler, he has looked very bad for a while. The Campman fight is the last time I remember him looking sort of good. Against Thiago Alves, he knocked him out with elbows, which everyone remembers, but they don't remember the first round was mainly him getting lit up on the counter. But then Alex Oliveira, tough welterweight, good welterweight, but not necessarily top welterweight. But he's coming off that barn burner with Yancy Medeiros, which was a real test on both men's chin and will, really. One of the things Medeiros was having success with was a long body kick. Front kicks to the body, both of them were using well. But Condit's game is a lot about kicking, and a lot about just placing kicks on that lead knee. He was one of the first guys to popularise the low-line straight kicks. And that sort of stuff against a heavy-handed brawler like Alex Oliveira, that's going to really piss him off and keep the range. For Oliveira, got to get him to the fence, because Carlos Condit's ring craft is woeful, but just beat him up and down with the hands, I'd say. Work him over on the body and try and elbow him in the head along the fence. I think standing out of range gives Carlos Condit a chance to work volume, even if he's not really hurting you. The number of strikes that he throws and lands. Leg jabs! I'll just leave it at that. And then Gaethje versus Poirier for the main event, which is the only reason really Adesanya, but the reason that I'd be tuning into this fight. You got two top 10 lightweights in the world on the same card against each other, which is nice, and it's free. And with Bellator as well, you got 3 of the top 20 lightweights in the world fighting, even if one of them's fighting a late replacement. So not a bad weekend, free TV wise, for the lightweights. I think for Poirier, the thing is, Eddie Alvarez really showed Justin Gaethje up by moving well, fighting on the outside, hitting the body. And I think that Eddie Alvarez, I think you can look at his fights and say that his best fights have been when he's the matador and not the bull. Chandler 2, RDA, and Gaethje. Probably the 3 best opponents he's beaten. And, fairly convincingly. The Chandler one was a really back and forth fight still, but I think he's much better circling the cage and being the matador than he is being the bull when he was like charging at Conor McGregor and giving him his usual counters. And he got drawn into it a little bit against Poirier that time too, so he's much more fun with his back to the fence. Lots of direction changes, really nice counters, and when he bangs the body, he really hurts people. He did it to Gaethje. So I just don't know if Dustin Poirier can do that though. What I do like about Dustin Poirier is like his redneck shoulder roll. He's always been a big banger and he's always been a little bit wild, but he's added a bit of science and he's got a decent shoulder roll, even from southpaw stance, which is fairly unusual. But if you watch him against like Pettis, the Pettis fight was only on the feet a little bit, but you can really see him looking more scientific. He's picking his shots. He gets Pettis to the fence. He's like throwing nice left straights down the centre and stuff, but he gets Pettis to the fence and he's switching between the left straight, left uppercut, left hook. He's going in and around his guard. He's never just content to stand and swing. He's really looked a lot sharper and more thoughtful lately. I don't know if he'll ever be like someone we remember as a technician, but I think he's getting to that point where people are going to consistently underrate his technique and be surprised when he puts in a bit of a sharper performance. Can be a little bit slow getting out of the pocket. The Johnson one is the most famous one. Lunges in, gets countered, goes stiff. But Gaethje is going to be trying to walk him down constantly, probably. Unless Gaethje's had a real crisis of character after that Eddie Alvarez fight. He's going to be walking him down. He's going to be high hands, elbows high, taking everything on the top of the head or the elbows. He's pretty good at defending his head when he's defending his head. The times he got stunned against Michael Johnson, he was either kicking or coming down off a kick or sort of overextending and chasing him. When he's actually covering up, walking forward, people watch him get hit in the head. I'm not saying it's conducive to a long career, but if you're getting hit in the top of the head, you're really not in trouble in the fight. So he's generally pretty good at tucking up and covering himself while he's moving forward. What I love about Gaethje is that he gets to the legs and he gets to the body. He's a big hitter, can knock guys out in one punch, but he doesn't fixate on it. And really, I put him and Edson Barbosa as 2 of the best low kickers in the lightweight division, but they're very different kinds of kickers. Edson Barbosa is an out in space low kicker, and that's wonderful if you're going to have a kickboxing match. But when you start running at him, as Khabib, Michael Johnson, Tony Ferguson, Beneil Dariush all did, he starts kicking while he's on the back foot and getting ploughed over. Whereas Justin Gaethje is the guy who moves forward and pushes you, both metaphorically in the fight and also physically hands on you, pushing you. And he'll push you off balance and he'll wait for you to punch and come back. And he's just finding these low kicks when guys are off balance or returning to guard. And those they're really heavy low kicks. They're not as pretty as Barbosa's, but they work every bit as well. And Poirier, being a hands-heavy fighter, or a heavy-handed fighter, if you will, now he's hand-centric, doesn't kick an awful lot, and his footwork's getting much better, but obviously the more you rely on your feet, the more you are going to struggle when you start getting kicked. We were talking about this with Keita versus Moicano, and Namajunas versus Jacek. The better your boxing is, the more you're relying on your feet, and the more you're going to be offset by a kick, even one good kick to the leg that jars it. So it's always this double-edged sword, because you have to have your feet out there more, your leg out there more, to box well and really make use of your hands to the full extent in MMA. And then once you start protecting yourself and pulling that leg back in, you're taking away some of those movement options, both footwork and head movement, because obviously you need to move your weight from one leg to the other to move your head. That's one that consistently surprises people, like when fighters who use a lot of head movement get worse at moving their head after eating some low kicks, because they think, oh, but the head's not the leg. But Robbie Lawler versus Johnny Hendrix the first time, he's moving his head a lot, but he's planting his feet to do it, because you have to. If you're moving your head side to side, you've got to have your feet set to do that. unless you're really fucking slick. So Lawler sets his feet, moves his head, gets ready to come back with counters, and Johnny Hendrix throws like 5, 6, 7, 8 punches and then ends with a low kick each time, and every time he's jarring Lawler's leg. But that's the card. I think that's a pretty solid card. I like the poster. You know, a lot of these posters are dog shit, but they've got like a 3D effect poster with each of the co-main and main event matchups. Oh no, it's the old poster because it got brown, but each man is either red or blue, and they're sort of overlapping. So I think maybe when you put your 3D goggles on, you get like a horrible tentacle man made of both of them. And then the other thing going on this weekend is Bellator. It was going to be Chandler versus Primus. That would have been really fun. And then Primus at some point, I didn't realise, pulled out. And then they got Brandon Gertz in there. And Brandon Gertz has a bit of a following. He's just not that great. He's lost 3 in his last 4. He's got a decent knockout in his last performance, and he did KO Derek Campos a few years ago. When was that? Oh, 2015, yeah. Oh, well, in fact, he's won 1 fight since then, losing a rematch to Derek Campos. Oh my god, he lost to Fernando Gonzalez. Well, now I'm definitely not convinced. Fair play to him for stepping up at the last minute. It's just, it does sort of ruin the card. Like, you know, they've got a couple of these wrestling prospects on there. Logan Storley, Kimbo Slice Jr., AJ McKee's the other one. And when are we going to get AJ McKee versus Irish lad? The Wolf ticket fight. But Kimbo Slice Jr., I've seen all of his fights, and I'm not excited at all by that. AJ McKee, fair enough. He's 11-4 his opponent. Justin Lawrence was on The Ultimate Fighter, the same season as Chiesa. Carries a 2-fight winning streak into this, so fair enough. At least they're not just feeding them bums. And of course, because it's Bellator, there's like 90 fights on this card and about 3 that you should care about or would care about if you were a really committed fan. I just don't like seeing Michael Chandler sort of doing nothing. You know, the Primus fight actually had a story with it. You know, I watched him beat Goichi Yamauchi rather, and you know, he's great. Like, I'm a huge Michael Chandler fan. It's just that he doesn't have the Bellator title, and he lost it under very controversial circumstances that people still argue under. The main appeal of this card was seeing Michael Chandler try and take it back. So I'm a bit bummed out about that, but, you know, I'll still watch whatever he does. I just probably won't watch the rest of the card. Unless something interesting happens, then you are more than welcome to tell me to. Oh my god, Adam Seller's on the card. I'm sorry, Adam. Right, let's do some questions before we get out of here for this week. One formal one from the mailbag, and then we'll do some quick-fire ones from the Facebook. Hi, Jack. I was watching Jacek Namajunas 2, and it seemed like Joanna made a couple of adjustments. A bit more feinting and more focus on low kicks, but clearly not nearly enough. What are good examples of fighters who have shown significant and successful tactical changes in a rematch with an opponent who beat them decisively in a previous fight? An example that came to my mind was McGregor in the second Diaz fight, but most fights that come to mind seem to be of fighters failing to do so. Barao Dillashaw 2, Holloway Aldo 2, JDS Velasquez 3, Silva Weidman 2. All the best, Karen. Okay, interesting McGregor-Diaz one. That's an interesting one, particularly because the book has already been written on Nate Diaz. You know, everything that Conor McGregor did against him was stuff that other fighters had already done in several other notable Diaz losses. It really was his stubbornness that prevented him from doing it the first time. He was focused on finding that uppercut or whatever it was that he'd been working on for Rafael dos Anjos, and pooped himself out. But I think an interesting example that just came to mind straight away when I read this question was Chuck versus Randy. I mean, it's a long time ago now, and obviously things have come on a long way, but Randy boxed his way into clinches and then battered Chuck in the clinches and took him down and hit him on the ground. In the second and third fight, you saw Chuck take on a more almost Anderson Silva-esque role, you know, moving around the cage, making use of the space, cutting angles, and moving offline. And at any time Randy had to try and get to him, he had to move straight towards him. Again, we talked about this with Khabib earlier in the week and Ronda Rousey and all that. You know, if your game is the clinch, you have to get to the clinch. And doing that involves going straight in on someone, whether you're shooting a takedown or whatever. It's a lot easier when you move them towards the fence, because then you can catch them going to your right or left and you can just step in that way. But yeah, Chuck used his footwork well in that fight. I mean, obviously, Randy's footwork wasn't like the best that we've seen in MMA, because now we got guys doing it much better. But and then there were a few moments where Chuck was almost on the fence anyway and sort of had to circle off. And, you know, thumb in the eye sort of helped. But so he learned from the Vitor Belfort fight. Actually, the Vitor Belfort fight is interesting because that's one where that's one of those rare trilogies where the man who won the first fight didn't win the second fight but won the third fight. So peculiar. Obviously hinges around the bizarre circumstances of the second fight, but that is how rare it is to win the first and third of a trilogy that we end up holding on to that fact. I've got a couple of others written down here. You mentioned JDS versus Velasquez 3, but JDS versus Velasquez 2 is an example of what we're talking about. In the first fight, you can watch Cain Velasquez try and box with JDS at range and kickbox with him. And JDS digs a couple of jabs to the body and right hands to the body, and Velasquez is trying to jab him in the head at the same time he does it. And then JDS goes down to attack the body. Cain tries to jab him in the head, and he gets a cross counter right across the top with the right hand. Beautiful stuff. Booming overhand. And, you know, in the rematch, Cain Velasquez was much more controlled and moving forward the whole time. He wasn't, like, hanging out and having a kickboxing match. He was getting in JDS's face and putting him on the fence and making him work. And that's what he did in the third match, too. So I would say that's a pretty good example. And on the JDS subject, Stipe versus JDS. First match, he accidentally finds out that he's doing well with his hands along the fence when he's cutting the cage on him and trying to get into clinches. And then the second fight, his team actually make him focus on that, and he tees off on JDS along the fence. An interesting one in that one man won all... not won all three, but the man who made the improvements never won the fight. But Fedor versus Nogueira is one that I always talk about, because in the first fight, Nogueira throws everything but the kitchen sink at him from guard. And the Nogueiras love playing knee shields and wrist control. And what they do is they take like a Kimura grip. They take a grip on one wrist, the knee shield in, and then start kicking under the arm and pushing the wrist down to make to attack an omoplata or reach over and grab a Kimura. Nogueira would have like the double biceps ride with his shins on Fedor, and Fedor would cup his hands over the front of Nog's quads to prevent him from like pushing the hand out and trying to kick into the omoplata. And it meant that Nog could hold the wrist, shoot his legs through into half guard, sit up and do that pendulum sort of, well, let's say pendulum, the Nog sweep, the one that he hit Tim Sylvia with. And he did it to Fedor once in their first fight and reversed position, and it was really one of the strong moments of the fight for him. Second fight, he comes out and he keeps attacking that like 4 or 5 times. That and arm drags. No working for omoplatas or anything like that. And, you know, he's attacking the sweep and then going to the knee bar and things like that. He's really confusing Fedor. And he hits an arm drag, and Fedor leaps forward to try and stop it and headbutts him. And that's when the fight's called off due to the cut. Third fight, Fedor makes the adjustment and kickboxes him for the whole fight and slings him to the mat with throws. But Nogueira, between the first and second fight, if you watch those 2 fights, his ground game, he works out what he did well in the first fight and what Fedor was open to, and he just mercilessly goes after it in the second fight. He had Fedor, he had Fedor on the back foot for most of the second fight, which is why he gets really frustrated when they call it off due to the cut. Right, time for a couple of questions from Facebook. Top strategies for MMA striking. God, this is supposed to be rapid fire. Hit them, don't get hit. When is the Russian takeover ever going to hit the UFC? Well, Bellator used to have a lot of Russians on the books, and they've sort of just dropped a lot of them. So I reckon we'll see more and more Ruskies coming to the UFC. Ruskies, is that racist? I don't think it is. Who should Nick Diaz fight in a return fight, and why is it Robbie Lawler? It's Robbie Lawler because everyone wants to see it. Though I would be up for putting him in a fight with either a smart, savvy outfighter who will embarrass him with footwork, and he'll move forward, getting his nose bloodied and going, well, I should have won on the scorecards, or a wrestler who'll just take him down and lay on him, and then he'll retire immediately afterwards. Having said that, do you know who'd be a really good fight for Nick Diaz? Rafael Dos Anjos. And you've got the built-in rivalry between Dos Anjos and the Diazes. That'd be a really good fight. Christopher says, there is this one technique that Bas Rutten teaches on his MMA video, which is essentially a clothesline. How viable do you think this move might be in MMA? Yeah, I mean, it's the same as like a Kote Uchi, a big overhand swing with the wrist. As long as you're not trying to hit with the knuckles while you're doing these spazzy arm movements, you're not going to hurt yourself. As if you're hitting with the bone of the wrist and things like that, and you're going to do that, you're fine. The problem is that obviously the straighter the arm gets, the easier it is to just sort of block it with an arm, or a guard or whatever. And it's certainly much easier to muffle it midway through. A tight hook goes around the opponent's guard as opposed to a straight arm which sort of just smashes into it. Jamie says, did you watch Quartet? And if so, what are your thoughts? I enjoyed it a lot more than I thought it would. The team dynamic really added to it. Yeah, loved it. I'm still watching it. I've mainly watched Sakuraba and Craig Jones because Craig Jones is my boy. Craig Jones going after the Sambo guy was brilliant. The Sambo guy was just, I'm not tapping, and I think heel hooks weren't allowed, so it was Craig Jones just pursuing knee bars. They did seem to allow knee reaps because Craig Jones just lives in the saddle position as opposed to like the knee bar sort of position. The 4-1-1, I think they call it in some BJJ circles. But yeah, I thought it was really interesting. His knee bars looked slick. Joseph says, which fight will Zab ruin next? Steve says, Condit versus Cowboy, discuss. I think we've done that. Remy says, Eddie Alvarez says he's Khabib's kryptonite. Thoughts? Well, Eddie Alvarez, like I said, he's better circling the cage and moving laterally than he is moving forward. And Khabib is an all-out aggressive fighter. He's not... I can't think of many fights where he's sat back. Jonathan says, what's your thoughts on Karate Combat not allowing left hooks? Oh, I don't know if we spoke about this. I watched Karate Combat mainly because I was like, Rafael Agaev in a full contact fight. Fair enough. And a lot of people got into it because Bas Rutten did some commentary for them. It's shite, really. It's really not great. It's trying to take karate into the modern age, but really their attempts to reinvent karate competition are about as successful as their attempts to reinvent the camera angles used during fights. They have about 20 cameras, and it's all over the place, and the rules make it really boring and shit. But, you get to see that a lot of these point karate guys are ripped because they wear no shirt, but gi pants. Right, I reckon that'll do us for this week. If you aren't a member of the Patreon, consider signing up. It allows me to do these podcasts each week, and we do a nice history episode, which is Tito versus Ken this time, and it's going to be good fun. We're talking about the Lion's Den and just reading about these twats choking each other out in, like, the kitchen, just sneaking up on each other and choking each other into unconsciousness. Just astonishing how stupid people were back then. And that's what we're doing this month, so sign up to the Patreon. If you haven't checked out the Fight Primer, that's where the Holloway versus Khabib piece is, and where I put up all my other pieces. If you haven't bought Notorious, consider it. And if you want to send an email to the podcast, fightsgonebipodcast@gmail.com. I'm your boy Jack Slack. Enjoy the ridiculous violence that Poirier versus Gaethje should hopefully be. And we'll be back here Monday or Sunday night to give what I hope is my first 5-star rating. Maybe. Cheers.